It is my great pleasure to welcome Molly Zahn from the University of Kansas. Molly became interested in biblical studies already as an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota, where she worked with Bernie Levinson. She then went on to Oxford to do the MPhil and did her PhD at Notre Dame, graduating in 2009. She has risen rapidly in the field. She is now editor of Dead Sea Discoveries and a member of the editorial board for the prestigious Hermeneia series. She has authored 2 books, Rethinking Rewritten Scripture, published in 2011, and Genres of Rewriting in Second Temple Judaism, published in 2020. She has also edited or co-edited 2 books and has published many articles. Molly has been at YDS at least once before. When she was deciding where to go to graduate school, she came and looked us over and decided to go to Notre Dame. We will not hold that against her. We are looking, Molly, we would love to have you here in person. At least we're glad to be able to have you here on Zoom. Her topic this evening is The Unfulfilled Past as Utopian Vision, Reading the Qumran Temple Scroll in its Second Temple context.
Thank you to all of you at the Divinity School and to Dean Sterling for the invitation to share my work. It's really a great pleasure to be with you all, if only virtually, and I look forward to a really fruitful conversation. I'm going to share with you today some fairly preliminary ideas arising out of my next major project, which will be a comprehensive study of the Qumran Temple Scroll for the Hermeneia commentary series. The Temple Scroll is in fact the longest extant scroll in the Qumran corpus. In its 65 preserved columns, it contains instructions for building a monumental temple complex, accompanied by a great deal of legal material regulating the use of and access to the temple complex and Israel's life in the land. Since its initial publication by Yigal Yadin in the late 1970s, 2 features of the Temple Scroll have drawn particular attention from scholars. First, the fact that most of the scroll's laws show close parallels to material from the Pentateuchal legal corpus, and second, the fact that the scroll casts itself as the direct words of God speaking from Mount Sinai. So the Temple Scroll consists of revealed laws and building instructions presented in the very voice of God. I have been working on the Temple Scroll in one way or another for more than 20 years now, but as I come to really focus on the commentary project, I find myself thinking about this text in a new way and asking different questions about it. Questions that I had never really thought to ask before and that I haven't seen addressed in the recent scholarly literature either. Briefly put, these questions have to do with what the specific aims of this text were, how it would have been read, and what kind of interactions it might have had or been meant to have with other key texts and traditions in its Second Temple period context. These questions, aim, purpose, context, might seem to be the obvious ones that any scholar of ancient texts would seek to answer in the course of their work. And of course, they haven't been entirely neglected for the Temple Scroll. Yet the nature of this text and the particular trajectories that scholarship on it has taken have meant that the energies of those who have worked on the scroll, myself included, have largely been directed towards other issues. So before I dive into my specific topic for today, which is considering the Temple Scroll from the perspective of utopian thinking, I want to say a little bit more about the contents of the scroll, and then sketch briefly some of these scholarly trajectories. And I do have some slides for this beginning part of the talk, so I'll share my screen. And then I'll go back to the beginning. And then I'll make it big. There we go. So the Temple Scroll is preserved in 3 main manuscript copies, 2 of which are quite fragmentary. So scholarship focuses largely on 11Q19 or 11Q Temple A, which is the well-preserved copy that was found under the floorboards of the house of the Bethlehem antiquities dealer Kondo at the end of the 1967 war. You can see some images there on the slide from the Israel Museum's website. As I mentioned, it is voiced in the first person as the speech of God from Mount Sinai, as you can see in this extract from column 51 that's on the slide. And its contents are almost entirely legal or prescriptive, commands to build the temple and its courts and other kinds of laws. There's almost nothing that's not phrased as a command. Here is a more detailed outline of the contents of the scroll. Unfortunately, as with so many texts from Qumran, the actual beginning and end are not preserved. The text picks up in media res with language drawn from Exodus 34, God's address to Moses when he returns to the top of the mountain after the incident with the golden calf. So this helps to establish the Sinaitic setting. After this, the instructions for building the temple itself begin. Unfortunately, this is the most poorly preserved section of the scroll. But we can read enough to determine that the temple building itself does not correspond exactly to any other set of Israelite or early Jewish temple plans that we know of. After the instructions for making the altar of burnt offering, the scroll turns to a detailed schedule of the offerings to be presented on the altar, beginning with the twice daily Tamid and moving on to Sabbath and Rosh Chodesh offerings, and then to the various annual feast days. This section of the scroll concludes with a rather striking passage at the end of column 29 that expresses God's covenant commitment to Israel. I'll be returning to this passage at several points in what follows, since it's one of the few that provides any kind of broader perspective or temporal horizon for the scroll's commands. The scroll then continues with instructions for the 3 courtyards surrounding the temple, including a gigantic outer court measuring 1,500 cubits, or nearly half a mile on each side. The instructions for the courts end with a set of regulations concerned with preserving the purity of the temple, which facilitates a transition to purity laws for Israelites living away from the temple in columns 48 to 51. The final section of the scroll, columns 51 through 66, contains other legal material mostly parallel to parts of Deuteronomy 12 to 24. Embedded within this section is a more extended law of the king, which begins from parallels to Deuteronomy's kingship law, but then adds substantial new material about the role of the king in warfare, constraints on the king's authority and marriages, and a section of blessings and curses. The inscribed sections of 11Q19 end in the middle of the laws on improper sexual unions that come from a join of Deuteronomy 23:1 and Leviticus 20. I also need to say a word about dating, which, as for so many early Jewish texts, is complicated. 11Q19 and the closely related manuscript 11Q20 both date from around the turn of the era. An earlier, likely 2nd century BCE manuscript, 4Q524, differs substantially in content, so it's not even entirely clear if it should be regarded as a copy or edition of the Temple Scroll at all, as opposed to some kind of source or related composition. Of course, the manuscripts provide only a terminus antiquem for the composition. It could have existed much earlier. As I see it, we have only 2 firm or firm-ish pegs to establish a date range. On the early end, the redaction of the Pentateuch, since the scroll clearly interacts with priestly and Deuteronomic material, and it knows late Pentateuchal texts like Exodus 34. And then on the late end, the date of the manuscripts themselves. I am trying to keep an open mind, but I do find a date later in the Second Temple period, closer to the dates of the manuscripts, more plausible than a date in the 5th or 4th centuries. The admittedly circumstantial evidence for this is, first, the signs in the manuscript witnesses of ongoing extensive revision, and second, the use of a calendar of festivals otherwise known only from the Qumran manuscripts. So I am working tentatively with the idea that the Temple Scroll as we have it in 11Q19 is a product of the late Second Temple period, the 2nd or possibly even the 1st century BCE. I should add, though, that despite the calendrical connections, the Temple Scroll does not show strong ideological connections to the classic sectarian texts from Qumran. So it is unlikely to be a product of the sect in a narrow sense, whatever we mean by that. Even from this brief overview, it will be clear that the salient features of the Temple Scroll are its legal nature, its claim to represent the direct speech of God, its extensive reuse of texts known to us from the Pentateuch, and its concern with the architecture of the temple complex. And indeed, these are the issues that have dominated scholarship. In particular, while important work has been done on the scroll's halakha and architectural ideas, the bulk of the attention to the Temple Scroll has had to do with its divine voicing and its relationship to the texts of the canonical Pentateuch. How is it using the older texts? What is the relationship between its use of older texts and its authority claim, and so on? Already Yadin, in his Editio Princeps, devoted considerable space to identifying scriptural sources for the Temple Scroll's wording. And two early monographs on the scroll by Dwight Swanson and Michael Wise both focused on this issue as well. As discussions of the phenomenon of rewritten Bible began to flourish in the early 2000s, the Temple Scroll played a major role as a parade example. For instance, in Hindi Naiman's Seconding Sinai, and in Sidney Crawford's Rewriting Scripture in Second Temple Times, as well as in all kinds of articles. And to circle back around to my own work, these issues of rewriting and authority were what first sparked my own interest in the Temple Scroll, and have been the issues that I've mostly focused on in many of my own publications. Now, all of this work has been tremendously important. There's no doubt that the voicing and the reconfiguration of earlier texts are critical elements of what the Temple Scroll is about. And evidence from the scroll has had important impacts on the broader conversation about the development of Scripture and scriptural interpretation in this period, a conversation that I remain very committed to. But all this concern about rewriting and interpretation and text production has left the Temple Scroll rather under-contextualized in its Second Temple context, as a Second Temple text. Yes, it's an example of what Naiman calls Mosaic discourse. Yes, it interpretively rewrites Torah, but to what end? We can presume that whoever went to the effort to compile such a text was aiming to make a contribution to conversations going on in their particular social setting. And the manuscript witnesses suggest that somebody continued to read and reflect on and update this text over the course of a century or more. So what was the point? In particular, what was the point of producing or reading in the late Second Temple period a set of commands for a temple allegedly spoken by God at Sinai that had obviously never been carried out, nor apparently stood much chance of being carried out in the future? And I'll elaborate on that characterization shortly. What are we to make of the disjunction between the historical and social setting of the authors, post-exile, colonized, or under the rule of the Hasmonean priest kings, likely awaiting or anticipating restoration in some sense, and their text, which they locate at the very origins of the covenant relationship, pre-Lan Nama, pre-monarchy, pre-temple? We know all kinds of people in the Second Temple period were reflecting on the nature of exile and the nature of the expected restoration, or more generally on how humans access divine wisdom. How does the Temple Scroll fit into this intellectual landscape? I should stress that the Temple Scroll does not make it easy for us to answer these questions. The contents and the framing of the scroll almost completely occlude the present-day context of its authors. It is not just the pseudepigraphic divine voicing. Plenty of other pseudepigraphic texts manage to make perfectly clear the true setting and interests of their authors. Daniel 7-12 is an obvious example of this. But the Temple Scroll's nearly uniformly prescriptive contents, it's a series of commands, combined with the ancient setting and the heavy use of scriptural language, leave very few clues as to the intentions of its authors. There are numerous lines of investigation that could be pursued to better situate the Temple Scroll in its presumed late Second Temple context. And indeed, such investigations could help clarify or narrow down that context. To give just one example, I am intrigued by the question of how the Temple Scroll, with its patently priestly interests, might have been understood in the light of texts such as Aramaic Levi, which are also concerned with the priesthood, but in an entirely different way. Today, however, I'm going to go in a different direction and focus on what might be learned by examining the ideal temple and ideal society of the Temple Scroll in light of other imagined sacred places or polities that would have been current in the Second Temple period. To put this another way, I want to propose that the Temple Scroll imagines a utopia or propounds a utopian vision of the temple and of Israel. And although I am not the first to use the language of utopia to describe the scroll, there has not been any sustained attempt to consider what exactly is meant by characterizing the Temple Scroll as utopian, and what kinds of insights or points of comparison might emerge from doing so. Actually, one of the most thorough efforts in this regard that I'm aware of comes from YDS's own John Collins in his essay, Models of Utopia in the Biblical Tradition from the year 2000. So in the remainder of my time today, I'm going to first elaborate on the utopian vision that the Temple Scroll creates, what it looks like, but equally important, how it is framed in time and space. I'm then going to bring in 3 texts for comparison, each of which in their own way propound a sort of utopian vision, and each of which the Temple Scroll clearly engages in some way. These are the tabernacle narrative as articulated in Exodus 25 through 40, the temple vision in Ezekiel 40 to 48, and the legal corpus of Deuteronomy. By describing these texts as utopian, all I mean to indicate at this point is that they imagine an ideal that is dislocated either in time, in space, or both from the historical and social reality of their authors. Comparing their framing, concerns, and interests with those of the Temple Scroll highlights what is distinctive about the scroll's utopian vision. In light of these comparisons, I then engage with recent scholarship on utopia in order to help shed light on the question of the possible purposes and functions of the Temple Scroll in its Second Temple context. The Temple Scroll's utopian vision is organized according to concentric circles of holiness, as noted long ago by Johann Meyer. Unlike other temple plans, the sanctuary in the Temple Scroll stands precisely in the middle of the nested series of inner, middle, and outer courts. Here's an image that I had to find off the internet as I'm still working mostly apart from my library these days. And this is of the temple and its courts. You see the temple building at the very center. The walls of the middle and outer courts are pierced by a series of 12 gates named after the 12 tribes of Israel. Outside the courts is the Ir HaMikdash, the city of the sanctuary, which is held to a level of sanctity and purity higher than that of the cities where the Israelites dwell. As Lawrence Schiffman has pointed out, this arrangement mimics the setup of the Israelites' camp in the wilderness, with the tabernacle at the center as described in Numbers 2 and 3. Just as the wilderness camp must be protected from impurity because God dwells there among the Israelites, so too the Temple Scroll prevents sexual, corpse, and other types of ritual impurity in the city of the sanctuary because of God's dwelling there. The Temple Scroll also exhorts the Israelites to maintain a state of purity in their everyday dwelling places, but it is clear that this is a lower level of purity than that demanded of the city of the sanctuary and of the temple itself. The authors of the Temple Scroll thus imagine an ideal Israel, arranged around an ideal temple where God would dwell among them. The status of this imagined space, though, is precarious. The Temple Scroll envisions it as commanded by God on Sinai. The setting at Sinai and the heavy reuse of Deuteronomy's formula, when you come into the land, strongly suggest that these commands should have been fulfilled. The temple should have been built upon the Israelites' entry into the land. There is no indication that somehow these commands are intended for a distant future. Yet they were not fulfilled. The temple that was eventually built, according to the Book of Kings, much less its post-exilic replacement, in no way resembled this grand complex God had commanded at Sinai. In this sense, the Temple Scroll's utopian vision constitutes a counterfactual or alternative past, a past that, according to the authors, could have been but was not. Whether they were really anticipating that a command whose fulfillment was so long delayed might yet come to be in the future is a question that I will return to. Before turning to our comparanda, I want to go back for just a moment to the key text I mentioned earlier, the end of column 29 of 11Q19. Coming as it does at the end of the schedule of sacrifices that the Israelites are to offer upon the altar, this passage clarifies that the faithful maintenance of the sacrificial cult will ensure God's dwelling among the Israelites and the presence of God's glory upon the sanctuary forever. No interruption in the blessing, no interruption in the relationship is envisioned. It will remain unbroken until that time, the enigmatic day of blessing, when God will establish God's own eschatological sanctuary. And this passage, with its explicit note that God will directly create a sanctuary at a later time, also clarifies another aspect of the Temple Scroll's utopian vision, namely that the temple whose construction God commands in the scroll is indeed a this-worldly temple, a temple that should have been built, not a heavenly or an eschatological temple. Now, in trying to make sense of this vision of an ideal temple commanded long ago at Sinai but never implemented, I found it instructive to compare it with other imagined spaces in biblical tradition. As I mentioned, both because the authors of the Temple Scroll were demonstrably influenced by all three of the texts I'm going to talk about, but also as a means of appreciating what is distinctive about what the scroll is doing. First, there is the priestly image of the tabernacle and the Israelite camp in the wilderness. To a significant degree, the formal structure of the Temple Scroll's building instructions seems to be modeled after the instructions for building the tabernacle that God gives Moses in Exodus 25 through 30. In both cases, the revelation occurs at Sinai. Both appear to begin with a command to collect materials, though the Temple Scroll is extremely fragmentary at this point. And then the building instructions themselves are formulated predominantly with the second person masculine singular converted perfect form vasita, you shall make. I've put just a few examples on the slide to just show this parallel syntactic structure. And of course, although the Temple Scroll imagines a permanent structure rather than a portable tent, the basic design of the Temple Scroll's temple and its furniture tracks that of the tabernacle. The Holy of Holies with the Ark, the Kaporet, the Keruvim, the outer holy area with the menorah, the table, the incense altar, and so forth. Apart from the structures themselves, I have already mentioned how the priestly idea of the Israelites encamped around the tabernacle with God dwelling in their midst forms a conceptual model for the Temple Scroll's imagined sacred space. Yet, though they share so much at the formal and conceptual levels, there are significant differences between the priestly wilderness tabernacle and the Temple Scroll in terms of the framing of the imagined ideal. In Exodus, Moses not only receives the divinely revealed instructions for the tabernacle, he also implements them, as we read in Exodus 35 to 40. The commands are fulfilled. From the perspective of the authors and readers of P, this ideal sacred space not only was commanded, it is claimed, came into being. It is a utopia that belongs to the past, to a no longer accessible part of Israel's history. It is not the counterfactual, unrealized past that the Temple Scroll imagines, but a quote-unquote real, though distant and irrecoverable past. I want to turn next to another priestly-oriented text, the book of Ezekiel, and in particular, the temple vision in Ezekiel 40 to 48. While the Sinaitic setting and the extensive reuse of laws from Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy have caused scholars to concentrate on the Temple Scroll's relationship with the Pentateuch, it clearly shares certain concerns and interests with Ezekiel. Most prominent among these is a concern with preserving the sanctity of the temple as God's dwelling place. By way of example, the slide shows the similarity of language and themes between Ezekiel 37, 26 to 28, and the end of Temple Scroll 29. Although there are differences, both passages stress the eternal presence of God with Israel, the eternal relationship between them, and the eternal presence of the sanctuary in Israel's midst. Beyond these themes, the Temple Scroll seems to show influence from Ezekiel in a variety of details, such as the size of the middle court, which is 500 cubits square, which is the size of Ezekiel's outer court, and the gates named after the tribes of Israel. Though in Ezekiel, these are gates into the city, not into the temple courts as in the scroll. And of course, like the Temple Scroll, Ezekiel imagines a temple that from the perspective of the author and audience does not exist and has never existed. However, as was the case with the priestly tabernacle, the framing of Ezekiel's utopian vision differs in significant and interesting ways from that of the Temple Scroll. First of all, as many commentators have pointed out, Ezekiel has a vision. He brought me in visions of God to the land of Israel and set me down upon a very high mountain. Reads chapter 40, verse 2. The temple is not described to Ezekiel in words or even shown in a blueprint, such as the one David shows Solomon in 1 Chronicles 28. An actual structure is shown to him. And although there are many prescriptions in Ezekiel 40 to 48 that regulate the use of and access to the temple precincts, there is no command at any point to build the structure. It is already there in the vision. There has been much discussion in Ezekiel scholarship on what exactly the intent behind this temple vision is. Is it a heavenly temple, an eschatological temple, a blueprint for an actual post-exilic temple, or purely a vision meant for study and contemplation? But whatever option one chooses, it's still quite different from the entirely prescriptive structure of the temple scroll, with its constant repetition of "you shall build" or "you shall make." Another prominent way in which Ezekiel's temple vision differs from that of the temple scroll has to do with where the vision is located in time. In contrast to the temple scroll's Sinaitic setting, at the beginning of the covenant relationship between God and Israel, Ezekiel's vision is explicitly situated after the rupture of that relationship in exile. The beginning of Ezekiel 40 dates the prophet's visionary experience to the 25th year of our exile, 14 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. The temple plan itself is very much presented as a function of all that has come before: the people's iniquity, God's departure from the sanctuary, and the subsequent destruction and exile. This is a new start, explicitly a restoration, as can be seen in chapter 43, especially in verses 6 to 9, where there's reference to the previous sin. What is more, as the text goes on in verses 10 and 11, it makes clear that the people's access to the temple plan is in some way connected to their feeling shame and remorse over their past behavior. In other words, Ezekiel's temple vision is inextricably linked to the exilic context in which it is set. Excuse me. The contrast between Ezekiel and the temple scroll on this point intrigues me. In particular, I find it striking how little attention the temple scroll pays to the idea of exile. Whatever the precise date of the scroll, it is clearly a product of the post-exilic period. As we can see from texts like Daniel 9 and the parenthetic opening of the Damascus document, Jewish groups continued to wrangle with the theological questions raised by the exile and subsequent foreign domination throughout the Second Temple period. Yet the temple scroll hardly engages with such issues. Instead, recalling column 29, it depicts an unbroken relationship between God and Israel, starting from the implementation of its commands, presumably after the entry into the land, and stretching without interruption into the future until the eschatological day of blessing. There is no mention of any threat to God's presence among Israel in the temple. How is such a counterfactual vision meant to be read in the Second Temple period? There is one passage in the temple scroll that mentions exile. In fact, it is the only other passage besides column 29 that departs from the prescriptive style, the issuance of commands, that dominates the scroll. This is a prediction of punishment for breaking the covenant that is found in column 59, which is part of the so-called law of the king. As is the case throughout the scroll, 5 or 6 lines are missing from the top of the column, so it is not clear how this topic is introduced. When the text becomes readable, it is describing exile and devastation, and goes on to portray these misfortunes as the result of covenant infidelity. At some unspecified time afterwards, in line 9, the people will repent of their sins, turn back to the Lord and to all the words of this Torah, and God will restore them to their land and reestablish a relationship with them. I shall be their God and they shall be my people, as it says in line 13. In light of this passage, maybe we should take the promise of an unbroken relationship expressed in column 29 with a grain of salt. Maybe it simply expresses the ideal, the best case scenario, which must be adjusted in light of reality. If we read the two passages in light of each other, we get an image not all that different from what is expressed in a text like the curses of Leviticus 26. Failure to obey the temple scroll's divinely revealed commands will result in destruction and exile, but even in that situation, repentance will lead to restoration and a renewed relationship. Yet I can't escape the feeling that maybe we are not meant to harmonize these two passages quite so quickly. There's one extremely noticeable gap in the destruction of exile and there's one extremely noticeable gap in the description of exile and restoration in column 59 when viewed from the perspective of the scroll as a whole. Where is the temple? It is theoretically possible that the destruction of the sanctuary could have been mentioned in the missing lines at the top of the column, but there's certainly no mention of a temple or sanctuary in the description of the restoration in lines 11 to 13. So in column 29, you have a promise of eternal relationship with God. I will be their God, they will be my people, that is predicated on the continued sacrificial cult with no mention of exile. And here in column 59, you have exile, restoration, and resumption of the God-people relationship, but no mention of the temple. I think it is possible that we may be dealing here with a section of the scroll with a different compositional history than the earlier columns. It's hard for me to see how a composer with such deep interest in the temple could put together a prediction of exile and restoration without any mention of the sanctuary. But be that as it may, I think the fact that the tension is not dealt with actually further illustrates my point that the composers of the temple scroll were rather disinterested in the entire issue of exile. Exile simply does not play a prominent conceptual role in the overall composition. The difference from Ezekiel's sustained reflection on the broken relationship between God and Israel, epitomized by God's absence from the sanctuary, is obvious. And I'm actually done with the slides, so I'm going to stop the screen share. Finally, I want to turn to Deuteronomy. Much of Dee's legal corpus is repeated in the latter columns of TS, sometimes virtually verbatim. Yet Deuteronomy differs from the other texts I've spoken about in its relative lack of concern with sacred space. Although the covenant stipulations laid out in its legal corpus include sacrificial regulations and a central role for the place that the Lord will choose, there's no reflection on what this place actually looks like, no plan of the sanctuary. Deuteronomy's ideal society arguably has Torah rather than temple at its center. In other ways, however, Deuteronomy's utopian vision is more similar to that of the temple scroll than either the priestly tabernacle or Ezekiel's temple vision. For one thing, like the temple scroll, its imagined ideal society is created through commands, and no record of fulfillment is included. Like the temple scroll, it suggests that the commands are to be implemented when Israel enters the land. Given that Deuteronomy, just like the scroll, was composed many centuries after the Landnahme would have taken place, it shares the counterfactual or unfulfilled aspect of the temple scroll. Deuteronomy, too, imagines an ideal society that should have come into being if only the Israelites had complied with the ancient commandments, now outlined for the first time in writing. This relatively quick tour through these three visions of an ideal sacred space or society allows us to see how the temple scroll can be understood as continuing aspects of all of them. On the one hand, the scroll makes use of traditions surrounding Sinai and the tabernacle as a basic setting and frame. In a way, I think the temple scroll also exploits a sort of timelessness in P, a disconnection from the later history of the nation, which of course for P is the result of the wilderness setting. Yet, unlike P, and more like Ezekiel, which is so deeply embedded in that later history, the temple and the surrounding Israelite society that the temple scroll imagines have never yet come to be. In the sense that it consists of a set of commands revealed long ago but never carried out, the temple scroll resembles Deuteronomy. Yet it combines Deuteronomy's interest in the organization of Israelite society in the land with Ezekiel's and P's interest in sacred space and the presence of God in God's sanctuary in the midst of the people. The temple scroll represents a creative intertwining of all these richly varied elements of Israel's literary traditions. Now I'd like to return to the broader question of what the temple scroll's utopian vision was for, how it might have been meant to work in its second temple context. We can say as an intermediate conclusion that the Temple Scroll stands at the crossroads of several different trajectories of literary tradition concerned in different ways with imagining an ideal Israelite society. And I want to make a point of noting that these trajectories do not run solely through texts that now belong to the Hebrew Bible, though those are the ones I have focused on today. In a way, the biblical parallels are low-hanging fruit, since it's so clear that the Temple Scroll engages and extends these traditions. But I look forward also to exploring points of contact between the Temple Scroll and other literary products of the late Second Temple period. But to return to the question of overall purpose or function, part of the reason I've been so interested to explore the Temple Scroll in light of other utopian traditions is that the perspective that they and recent scholarship on them can bring to the question of what the composers of the scroll might be trying to do by imagining this magnificent but impossible temple, this commanded but never implemented model for God's presence atop the sanctuary and among Israel. For, as I noted, despite the relatively frequent use of the adjective utopian to describe the Temple Scroll, there has not been much attention to what is meant by that term. For the most part, I think, again, scholars seem to have gotten stuck on questions of the scroll's exegesis of earlier scripture or of the authority of its halakha, and I include myself in this category. More recently, though, I have found that exploring the idea of utopia and some of the scholarship on how utopias can work and what they are intended to do has helped me begin to approach a more integrative view of the scroll in its Second Temple context. The biggest issue regarding how utopias work is their relationship to reality, their implementability, if you will. There is a strong tradition in biblical studies of associating utopias with eschatological prophecy, that is, perfect futures that are brought about through divine agency. On the other hand, trends within utopian thought in the modern period have tended to emphasize the practicality, the humanism of utopias, that utopias are alternative, not yet actualized, but achievable better models for human societies. The utopian visions of the texts I've discussed here today, insofar as they have been theorized as utopias at all, seem somewhat caught in the middle. None are in cloud cuckoo town, as Hagedorn memorably calls it, a fantastical or otherworldly place. They all assume institutions or social structures or even physical spaces that were known to ancient Israelites and Jews. Sometimes this fact leads scholars to deny that these texts are utopian at all, and this seems to have been the case a lot with Deuteronomy in particular. Yet at other times it has led to what, in my view, is a tendency to overestimate the practical or the realistic aspects of these visions, to see Deuteronomy's legal corpus or Ezekiel's temple vision as concrete plans for creating a new and improved society in the wake of the exile. This tendency can be observed in scholarship on the Temple Scroll as well, with several scholars maintaining that the scroll was primarily meant to inspire actual reform of Second Temple practices. Without discounting the real hope that lies at the root of much utopian thinking, I want to propose that the texts themselves suggest a more nuanced understanding of how they were meant to bring about a different and better future. Leaving aside the tabernacle narrative for the moment, since it is described as fulfilled in the past, neither Ezekiel's temple vision, nor the Temple Scroll, nor even Deuteronomy can be described as particularly realistic. Ezekiel's temple is not located at any named point within the land. Rather, it is on a very high mountain, with mythic elements like the stream of water that issues from under the temple, and the 12 tribes arranged in schematized fashion in strips across the land. The Temple Scroll is similarly vague about the location of its temple. The gigantic size of its outer court, which is much bigger than the historical Temple Mount, suggests that it does not have the physical space of Jerusalem in mind. And its image of the city of the sanctuary is unrealistic in another important way. I have always been struck by the fact that the scroll legislates that the only toilet serving the temple city be located 3,000 cubits, nearly a mile outside the city. Deuteronomy's vision of an ideal society might strike us as more realistic, but it too has elements that strain credulity, such as a king who sits around reading Deuteronomy all day. The point here is not to try to determine exactly what counted as realistic for ancient authors and audiences. It is rather to suggest that getting too hung up on how or whether these visions could actually be implemented is beside the point. I want to explore how the imagination itself, the construction of the vision, might function, aside from any direct attempt to implement the vision in real life. As Benno Jacob suggests in his Exodus commentary regarding the priestly tabernacle, the point is not the technical details themselves, but rather the text, quote, provided guidelines for specific religious thought. In other words, reflection on an ideal might serve an affective or intellectual purpose more than as a concrete blueprint for action. Recent work by biblicists that engages with the larger field of literary utopian studies confirms that the point of utopian thinking is not necessarily to formulate concrete plans for action. Frauke Uhlenbruch defines utopia as serious heuristic play with a given social situation and how it might relate to a hypothetical different situation. She suggests that the achievable goal of utopia is best characterized as the journey itself. Der Weg ist das Ziel. More concretely, Stephen Schweitzer, in his illuminating work on utopian features of the books of Chronicles, proposes that the main function of utopias is to reject the status quo. Utopian literature, quote, critiques the present situation by offering in its place a better alternative reality that is based on different principles than the current reality. Schweitzer reads Chronicles not, as it often has been read, as a simple projection of Second Temple realities back into the monarchic period, but rather as using the genre of historiography to propose an alternative reality, not one that could actually be implemented because it is said to have taken place in the past, but one that expresses particular values and convictions about the principles upon which Israel is to be organized. A similar direction has been taken in some recent work on the function of Ezekiel's temple vision. The text that, of all of those I've talked about today, is the one most frequently identified as utopian. While some trends in scholarship continue to view the vision as a blueprint meant for actual implementation in a restored Judea, and others view it as a prophecy of an eschatological temple, numerous scholars have interpreted the vision as purely imaginary, with no intention or expectation of implementation, whether by humans or by God. Susan Niditch describes Ezekiel's vision as a kind of mandala, at once symbolizing and making present the divine realm, while Stephen Cook in his new commentary describes it as a teaching picture, a literary icon. Hannah List continues this train of thought, suggesting that Ezekiel's temple vision textualizes the divine presence, such that God's holiness is now to be experienced by means of the text of the vision, rather than in any physical location. I find all of this extremely suggestive for the Temple Scroll. On the one hand, Schweitzer's analysis of Chronicles suggests that the Temple Scroll be understood not so much as a series of halakhic or architectural reforms to be implemented, but as expressing an alternative set of principles by which reality should be, but is not, ordered. For the Temple Scroll, these principles include, for example, the concentric arrangement of Israel around the sanctuary, and the maintenance of the ritual purity appropriate to the presence of God in the midst of the people. The implicit critique of the status quo, in which Israel protected neither themselves nor the sanctuary from impurity in the rigorous way the Temple Scroll envisions, is clear. On the other hand, the parallels with Ezekiel's temple vision indicate that the possible functions of the Temple Scroll might go beyond critique. Perhaps the Temple Scroll, too, provides a way to experience God's presence through contemplation of its textual sanctuary. As Niditch says of Ezekiel, the vision is the building, is the cosmos. The vision's images, reported in words, form pillars and courtyards and constitute a world. Although the Temple Scroll frames its sanctuary through divine command rather than prophetic vision, it seems to me that the effect could be the same. In the sense that the Temple Scroll's temple might in some sense stand in spiritually for the physical temple in Jerusalem that the authors would have seen as deficient, we get a clear indication of how and why this text might have been received and preserved by the community at Qumran. They too created alternatives to participation in the Jerusalem temple cult, though they did so by imagining themselves, the community itself, as a stand-in for the temple, or by transporting themselves ritually to communion with the angels in the heavenly sanctuary. There is one additional way in which I would tentatively propose that the framing of the temple scroll as a set of ancient but unfulfilled commands might have resonated with the Qumran Yachad. The scroll, as we saw in column 29, predicates God's presence among the Israelites on the building of its temple and institution of the proper sacrificial cult. If we take this seriously, it might reasonably be argued that for the authors of the temple scroll, God has never truly been present among the people, at least not since Sinai. The authors in this line of thinking would be saying, this is what the temple should have been, but it's not and never has been. And thus, God has never fully been with us. In God's own time, on the day of blessing, God will come and build God's own temple. Till then, what we have is this image, this text, this memory of the perfect sanctuary and society that we once had a chance to build. This rather pessimistic perspective seems quite compatible with the anthropological pessimism of the Qumran sectarians. The admonition in columns 2 and 3 of the Damascus document says that nearly all humanity, including nearly all of Israel, has followed the sinful urge, the Yetzer HaShama, instead of following God's commands. Only Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are recorded as friends of God. The building up of a new covenant with the chosen remnant, including the revelation of the proper means of observing the law, is attributed to God's initiative and God's mystery, not any human agency. From another angle, the Thanksgiving hymns, or Hodayot, are known for their stress on the baseness of humanity, what Newsom calls negative anthropology, and the impossibility of achieving righteousness without God's mercy. The idea in the temple scroll is a little bit different. The idea that Israel has never been able to get its act together to construct the temple according to God's instructions doesn't quite offer the same full-blown anthropology, and I don't think it assumes it. That is, I think there's still a considerable distance between the temple scroll and what we find in texts like the Damascus document and the Hodayot. But one can certainly understand how the scroll should be read, or could be read, against the backdrop of such an anthropology, which might well explain why 2 very fancy 1st century CE copies of the scroll were found in the Qumran caves. So to step back a moment and sum up, there are 2 main takeaways that I'd like to highlight by way of conclusion. First, I have tried to take a more holistic or integrative approach to the temple scroll's engagement with earlier traditions. Its reuse of priestly, Deuteronomic, and Ezekiel traditions is not just about adopting certain details or exegeting particular passages. Rather, it is also interacting with these traditions on a more conceptual level, in terms of how they conceive of the relationship between God and Israel, how they imagine the past, the present, and the future of that relationship. It is not simply reproducing or mimicking any one of these traditions, but creatively extending them as it triangulates between them. Second, I have tried to use the comparison with earlier traditions and insights from the scholarly conversations surrounding them to gain some purchase on a more expansive understanding of the temple scroll, of what it might mean to create or to experience this text in a Second Temple context. Employing the framework of utopia is obviously just one way of getting at this question, but I hope to have shown how thinking in these terms can give new perspective on the possible goals and functions of this most fascinating and enigmatic of texts. Thank you.